Hey, folks. Welcome to another episode of Hot Data. I'm your host, Josh Robinson. Today, I'm joined by some really cool people, Srini and Tom. How are you guys doing today?
Doing well, thanks.
Yeah, doing
Awesome.
great.
All right. So, as we kind of have talked about previously in our own offline conversations, we kind of want to talk about bots and the problem that they can cause. And so, I kind of wanted to start out in from a bigger picture. We've all heard about bots on the internet, but what's actually happening right now that companies should be paying attention to?
Yeah, bots on the internet. So the interesting thing is that if you think about it, they've been around the internet since the beginning,
Mm.
and they've been a core part of the internet and a lot of the transactions that are happening online. I think to your point, what's actually different about what's happening right now? I think there's probably two things I would point to that come to mind. So first is there's a lot of these hosting providers and CDNs and other companies that are now coming out and saying that, recently, as of like last year is the first time that we're seeing majority of the traffic actually coming from bots, which is a little bit of a new phenomenon. The estimates vary, but it's kind of it's a pretty interesting kind of new trend that's part of the internet now. And second is we're seeing this huge rise in this new category of bots, which are AI bots. And so this was a category that didn't really exist that much a few years ago, and now we're seeing a big rise in bots from these large LLM providers or other companies building agents. It's in general bots that are being used to train AI models or themselves powered by AI models. There's kind of a large diversity of AI bots. And that's kind of the new emerging thing that we're seeing. And so anyone who's operating on the internet, it's definitely a bit of a sticker shock for them to both see and hear the stat of majority of their traffic might be not from humans, but actually from bots. And on the second hand, there's also this new category that people are trying to understand and make sense of. And so that's from my point of view, what's really been happening in the last few years that's kind of really new with bots on the internet.
If I could add in there real quick, one thing that comes to mind when we start talking about bots is like it's a scary name. It feels like artificial, cyborg, whatever. It's important to recognize that just because something's a bot doesn't mean it's bad. It's important to manage the good qualities of bots as well as it is to manage the bad quality of bots. For every time you've got a bot that comes in and is maybe trying to bypass some built-in system to determine you're a human, you've got another bot that's coming in to scrape your site for a web browser or for a search engine, for example, or routing additional traffic to you based on what they found there. So I think it's important to make sure to accept that both bots have this dual potential to be good and bad.
I agree with that. And I think we want to drill down on that a little bit more. So as we talked about the AI bots, right, specifically, how do they differ from the traditional bots? Like you had mentioned before, Tom, some are for SEO, and other ones are just like pulling information off of your site. Like which ones should we be watching for, or how should we interact with those?
Yeah, it's an interesting point because in the past, there's definitely been classes of bots, like the ones operated by search engine websites, where it was a bit of a more symbiotic relationship. In fact, companies have been trained to make their website easily available to those bots. There's a whole industry, SEO, which is completely focused on how do we make sure that these bots can find and crawl my website, which is pretty interesting.
Kind of amazing how much money is
Yeah,
made just on
absolutely
that.
crazy. Exactly. And that indicates to me that that's a class of bots that people want on their website. AI bots are a little bit more of a toss-up. In many cases, they're there to serve the needs of the company operating those crawling bots. And oftentimes there's maybe not as much of a symbiotic value exchange. And I think that's where if these bots are primarily coming to scrape content for their own needs, there's kind of both the cost angle there where you're kind of serving potentially many gigabytes of images and text and other assets to these bots, and you're not really seeing anything in return as someone who operates a service on the internet in many cases. And I think this is kind of a new thing, and they're coming repeatedly. So in some sense, they might feel like search engine bots, but the value exchange in many cases just isn't there. And I think that's probably the main difference between some of these between AI bots, the more traditional ones that people were thinking about.
I think there's also sort of a semantic functionality difference between the two. Web crawler bots are very good at doing exactly what they're called, at crawling the web. They find indices, they find listings, and then they can track, sort of the classical REST model where it's like, okay, this is hyperlinked to this, and this is hyperlinked to this, and then we'll find it through that. But, they had some intelligence, and I use that term very loosely, in the sense that they had heuristics that they could use to make decisions about where to walk. One of the differences of this new world of bots, in my mind, is that the bots themselves are trying to understand the meaning of what the page is, not just the relationships between the pages, but what the content on the page itself means and how a user would try to impact that. Part of the problem is that that's just inherently non-deterministic. Like, you don't know exactly what's going to come out of it. So it creates a scenario where, we're trying to predict the behavior of these bots, and it's almost impossible without having a whole bunch of data around what they're trying to do. Like, we're still in the stage of, yes, we know that these bots are acting, whether it's by, based on a request from a specific human, or, they're just out there generally scraping based on some kind of general prompt or trigger, but we don't really know what that means yet. And I think that that's the first step to understand, like, how we want to engage with them, whether that be, stopping certain traffic, encouraging other traffic. Like when web crawlers first came out, people knew that there was going to be this notion of SEO a little bit, but that whole industry evolved as people understood how these bots actually worked. And I think that that's going to be a big part of this as well. There are real concerns that websites and the internet needs to take into account in general. But I think we're still in the early stages of understanding what those are.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I think as industries grow and as we learn more about the behaviors, we also want to talk about like the actual impact and how bots are impacting businesses today. Could you give us any examples of where bots impact businesses, whether it be from revenue concerns or overages or anything like that?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. We're definitely seeing a lot of very public case studies, even outside of our own customer base. There are people publicly coming out and saying that they've struck up deals with some of these LLM labs and vendors. The New York Times and The Atlantic are two famous ones. The Telegraph is also kind of a famous example as well, where they are actually, even because of the revenue risk, where basically these publishers, their primary business is having content on the web and people coming and consuming that content, and there might be advertising or subscription kind of business model. So if these LLM tools are kind of making that unnecessary because people are able to get the information they need through them, or just in general, people are able to skip going to a search engine to maybe find and end up at the same news article, then that's definitely an impact, because it's eyeballs lost for these content-driven companies. And on the flip side, they're paying bills, they're paying money to CDN providers and others to serve
And
content.
to reporters.
And to reporters. And it's all that is like, so we're paying money and investing a lot here, and we're not getting, the return on that investment that we're making. So I think there's two things, mentioned there. One is like direct revenue risk, in the sense of your business model is being threatened. And for those, like the Telegraph and others, they might choose to straight up block AI bots entirely. For others, as I mentioned, New York Times and The Atlantic, they've decided to charge a massive licensing fee as kind of their remediation strategy. And there are others where we have some customers that we've worked with where the general serving of content to bots has led to six-figure overages. So AI bots, non-AI bots, just the whole gamut of bots. There's a cost associated with it, and without really a direct benefit to the business. And so those are two that come to mind.
I think there's another one that we should call out that I don't think has been documented well, except sort of in the world of science fiction, which is, those are all basically opportunistic, but fundamentally non-malicious. We've got AI bots that are doing the work that a human would do in order to collect all the information from these different sites, but not, leveraging the ad revenue for the companies themselves. There is potential for a class of malicious AI-driven bots that are able to adapt rapidly to what kinds of defenses are put up. I don't think this has really been as front of mind right now, although I'm sure people are thinking about it. But I do think that it's something that is going to have to be considered more as time goes on. Like, how do we prevent these adaptive and I say adaptive, I say thinking. That's not really what they're doing, but they have beyond heuristic to more complex probabilistic ways of making decisions about what the bot is going to do. And so I do think there's going to be room in the future for like, what kind of new attack vectors does this actually create? I think it goes not just for people hosting sites, but also people who are leveraging these AI bots locally. How do you know that it is who it says it is? I think that's a real fundamental problem that we're going to have to discuss as we move forward.
I think that makes a ton of sense. I think now that companies are aware that bots are a problem, they've gone out and bought or invested in bot management tools. But even those aren't doing the job 100%.
No.
So based on what you guys are seeing out there, what's missing?
I would say, and then I want to kick it over to Srini, but I think one important thing here is like, do we know exactly what the job that needs to be done is? And I don't think we do. Like, we have essentially this hammer of bot detection and mitigation services that are like, okay, we see this, we're going to block it. We don't know why. I think is one of the problems. So that's my first reaction to that.
Yeah, totally agree. I think it's easy to get into a very tactical operational mindset where there's a signal and then you kind of react to it. But I think there's so many different types of bots. They're constantly changing and adapting. So it's really hard to get a long-term view into what the bots are doing and trying to fingerprint identify the types of bots that they are, and maybe even unmask the people behind them and the organizations behind them. That alone requires a lot of work, and then try to do it in a strategic way where your bot strategy is aligned with what the business actually needs or your organization needs, what different teams in that organization may have different needs. And I think having a really comprehensive view of that's long-term and more strategic, I do think that's a gap in the market that many really advanced teams and sophisticated teams that are able to invest in it, they are kind of building their own solutions and products to complement what the bot manager products are doing. So I think that really speaks to some of the limitations that those tools have, which is they're great for what they're good at, which is this tactical operational view. But if you want a longer term view into the data, if you want to make more strategic decisions, that's just kind of a gap right now with those.
Yeah, I think Srini, you hit the nail on the head right there. Wow, I'm sort of in a nail theme today, hammer and nail theme. But I think that there's a lot of one-off silo kind of solutions going on right now because every company, and part of this is inevitable because companies have different needs, but there are always going to be commonalities between what individual users need. And so I think a lot of groups are building solutions that are very specific to their own use case, but that's the kind of thing that like you get enough of them together and there actually are these common patterns. Not every company is completely unique, but I think that right now, because of the landscape of this bot management world, everybody's having to build a completely unique solution. If they want more than the standard, we're going to figure out what's a bot and we're going to block it. I mean, I'm being a little bit glib here. There's more sophistication than that, but I do think that it's such a new and burgeoning industry that there's not a lot that is being provided that other than what companies build themselves.
And that makes a ton of sense. And even with companies who are creating their own tools or they went out and got some tools off of the market, most of those tend to be operationally focused. So in that mindset, like, why does that matter? And kind of what does that mean versus all the things that we see from bots or versus like situations like real-time blocking versus strategic management or tactical versus strategic needs for your bot management or your bot analytics or anything like that. Can you give us a quick like insight into that?
I'll actually let Tom answer this one.
Yeah, I think that the challenge there is that when you start thinking tactically off the bat, you end up with a kind of, one solution fits all kind of approach that you say, okay, well, we're going to go in and we're going to test to see if this is a bot, see if it fits into this classification, see if it fits into this classification. And if it does, okay, we'll let you block it. We can auto block it, or we can let you specify to block it. But there's a lot of nuance that comes from understanding the behavior behind what those bots are doing that may make you want to act differently. So, for example, you may have a situation where you kind of, you don't want to completely block out a bot, but you want to throttle it, or you want to have a certain time frame during which you take action against it, but then it's released again, to avoid sort of the false positive kind of scenario. And I think that those are the kinds of problems that we don't have enough understanding of the full scope of the problem in order to truly come up with solutions. And so I definitely don't think it's this kind of scenario where you shouldn't do any of that. Like, that's all, like, we have to do that to explore the problem space, and obviously to mitigate the immediate situation. But I think there's a lot that needs to be explored in terms of, like, what are the behaviors that we're seeing? What are the behaviors that we expect? And then what are the behaviors we want, and how to mitigate those? And so I think there's going to be a bit more need for that analytic perspective. The tactical approach is stop the flood, right? You've got to somehow put a sandbag in front of the levee. But that is only going to scale so far as these challenges become more sophisticated, more nuanced, and we start to understand them, which is, why I emphasize so much my feeling that, like, it's the taking the data and having the analysis, the ability to analyze it, to understand what these behaviors are, that's so critical at this juncture. Because there's a crazy amount of data out there, there's so many bots going everywhere. It's the kind of thing that can be explored. And I think that's really the critical piece here to complement the pure tactical approach.
Yeah, and just to quickly expand on that, the combination of kind of the short-term operational and tactical view with the long-term data collection analytic view, it's actually what we've seen in a lot of other areas like identity fraud or credit card fraud or payment fraud. You need something to stop the bad people in that second when they're applying for something or trying to take action or extract money. But you also need kind of a long-term view to identify the underlying patterns and behaviors so that the things you're able to automatically block things that meet obvious criteria, the things that rise to the level of kind of short-term blocking or action-oriented reaction to whatever is happening is more informed as well. So I think the short-term view is great. You do need that when you're in the weeds, but you do need to kind of have the backdrop as well. So you're just more sophisticated in your approach. And again, as we talked about earlier, there's tons of useful bots out there. You don't want to block those either. So you do need a deep understanding of what is useful for your organization and which types of bots are not. And it's a more holistic view. And it requires kind of a longer term view.
I think there's interesting things on that front too, because there are ways increasingly, just like, if you think about original web crawling bots with the introduction of like robots.txt to kind of hint them, there are ways that we may not even know of at this point to train bots on the kind of actions that we want them to be taking and to discourage them from the kind that we don't want. So, there is the LLM.txt right now, but that's pretty static in the same kind of way that robots.txt is. I think that if we have this data, there's sort of a feedback cycle where we can see what they're doing and understand the behaviors, and then we can also see how changes that we make in how we interact with the bots change their behaviors. And that's one of the kind of fun and exciting things about these AI bots, these things that are driven by more complicated statistical non-deterministic models, is there really is room for that kind of emergent behavior to learn about. And, as that's not really fun as somebody who's like running a network, but as somebody like me who kind of gets to kind of explore these things, it's really fun.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. As we've talked about needing to learn the bot's behavior over a period of time and understanding what they're doing, this kind of leads us right into bot insights. At its core, what problem is it solving?
Yes. So bot insights is trying to provide that holistic, strategic, historical, long-term view into bot traffic and bot behavior that we think a lot of organizations are missing. or they've kind of built on their own and they have to painfully manage. And so, it really feeds into what we just talked about, which is how do we help teams move beyond the short term and the tactical and move towards the more strategic view where they really think about what does the organization really need, what do different teams really need, and how do they each want to think about bots and classifying them and trying to understand which ones drive value and which ones don't, and then taking that strategy and actually being able to implement it probably in the existing bot manager tools that they're already using, and then validate that that set of policies and that strategy is continuing to be adhered to. So I think that's really where we want to complement the existing bot manager tools that companies may already be using, but be able to actually provide a longer term view, helping them drive more strategic discussions and just helping them really get their hands around the bot problem as well in many cases, because many organizations don't even know how big of a problem it really is. They might read a stat like 50% or a majority of traffic is from bots. They might be wondering, is that the same for my business and my web properties, or is it maybe even higher in some cases, or lower? And I think that's really where we want this bot insight solution shine, is kind of complement the existing products that someone may already have and helping them move beyond just the tactical.
Yeah, and I think extending that a little bit, I think that there is the potential for bot insights to capture some things that we don't expect. And I alluded to this a little bit before, but for example, if we hypothesize that most of the bot management solutions out there are able to manage context for a limited period of time, like 30 days, when we have these sort of adaptive agents that are working with the systems, they're going to figure that out. And they're going to start to create strategies to get around that kind of limitation, to be like, okay, well, if we hit this every 5 days or 1 day or whatever, we're going to start, we're going to get blocked or whatever. And they're going to adapt to these types of short-term behavioral blocks. And the ability to have this longer-term corpus of data that you can examine and understand to drive your decision making, it gives you that flexibility to have whatever actioning tools you're working with, whether it be a third party or something you've built in-house, or even something that is worked on with hydraulics in some way. It gives you that capability to analyze the entire picture, as opposed to like, okay, we've got this snapshot, we know what happened here. And I think that companies are doing this, and they're saying like, oh, hey, we only have this limited window with the bot management tool we're working with. So we're going to have to pull it in and store it and do our analysis and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's really where one of the big opportunities from bot insights is coming into place, is that we've got that already in place to kind of facilitate that workflow.
I think that makes a ton of sense. And as a new product or feature here at Hydraulics, one of the things that you just talked about is like how it can work with people's current bot management system. But what other features, like you said, they'll be able to query basically information from right now to all the way for a year from now? What other benefits outside of some of the ones that you listed could you think of that bot insights could give a company?
Yeah, I could speak to that a little bit. I think being able to, as we talked about, one of the themes in this episode so far has been that the categories of bots have changed so much over time as well. Again, I think with the very 30-day kind of limited window, you're not really getting to experience that as much. You might log in and see something, and you don't really have a ton of context for, is this actually a new LLM company? Is this a new, some other type of organization that's coming and onto my website, and through bots? I think being able to see, like a rises in new types of bots that are happening, I think is really unique. You can even in some cases, if you've really done a good job here, you can even pinpoint the exact day that a target vendor has started crawling and trying to scrape your your web content. And I think that's, being able to say that this is the date that it started, and this is when we implemented some policy, and this is the change that happened, and maybe they found a way around it and they came back, and then you did something again. I think that whole life cycle, right? Bot policy enforcement, it's really the only way you're going to get that clarity is having a really good long-term historical view. And I think that's super important. So yeah, the long-term view is critical here. Being able to see the rise and fall of different categories of bots and even specific vendors, I think is important. And then again, long-term policy enforcement is also something that, Bot Insights can help with.
Absolutely.
I think Bot Insights provides a couple of unique tools that aren't necessarily going to be available from others. And the long term is a huge part of it. There's also the notion that your tactical decision making type data can live side by side with your long term analytic data. Like, the ability to get the data into hydraulics so quickly and have really low latency eyes on glass for decision making is really valuable. And oftentimes you'll have your purely operational system that's working on a minute level or a day level, and then you'll have your long term storage. Having that all in one place gives a lot of flexibility. The other thing is the ability to ingest new types of data that come in very, very easily into Bot Insights and have it automatically integrated into the Bot Insights solution is really a powerful and unique tool that I don't think you get from other solutions. Srini, you were commenting, these things evolve, who knows what it's going to be next
Yep.
year, and who knows what kinds of solutions are going to be out there that you can incorporate into your existing analytic and operational solutions. And I think that that's completely critical. One of the biggest challenges for people is this data overload that we have these days and an inability to manage it or to consolidate it or to get it working together. And I think that Hydraulics Bot Insights really provides a powerful framework to get new data types integrated on the fly without losing what you've had historically.
And one thing I'll quickly add as well is for many large organizations, they might actually be operating on multiple hosting platforms, and an individual platform's bot manager product might give a very partial view. And so then you're kind of having to go to multiple places and compare, and all that gets in the way of building kind of a long-term strategic view of the bot problem if you have to go to all these disparate tools. So, and the bigger the organization, the larger, most likely the larger the number of tools that you have to resolve. So that's another thing that's relevant here.
Yeah, you miss the forest for the trees because there's a lot of trees.
Yeah, exactly.
So as we talk about the product, we want to talk more about like the users too, right? And so let's talk about kind of like different personas. Like how would a publisher or content producer use Bot Insights differently than a CTO?
Yeah, I'll let Tom start with this one.
Well, I mean, I think that's sort of has been the story. The whole story here is like, we have ideas. A CEO or a CTO is going to be far more concerned about understanding the specific cost impact in terms of the amount of traffic that's being lost, potentially the amount of impressions that are being lost if it's an impression driven type organization. And Bot Insights is designed from the ground up to capture that information and make it available quickly to that persona. Someone on the operations side is probably going to be more interested in, are we getting pounded from particular IP addresses or particular ISPs that we're not expecting? Are we seeing resources being consumed that are not what we wanted to be getting? I think that level of data is also exposed through the Bot Insights. And I think that what we're going to see is moving towards a more customized, persona-driven implementation of some of the views that are exposed by Bot Insights. The critical piece is that Bot Insights contains the information and the underlying tooling to service all of those. I think that, we've got these different personas. We've CFO or CTO, we got your security InfoSec person, we've got your marketing person, we've got your SEO, we've got, all of these different personas that are going to be looking at this data from different perspectives. But having a single place where all of that can be synthesized into a single data set with different snapshots and views on top of it, that's where the power of Bot Insights really comes in. It's the ability to service the different personas as opposed to, okay, well, we've got a vendor who's going to help us understand how this is impacting SEO. And we've got a vendor who's going to help us understand in a new dashboard from another company that's going to help us understand where the costs are going. And that really gets to Srini's point again about having disparate points of entry to the data can be valuable if they're, clearly formed and easily accessible, but it doesn't scale over time to have things spread out all over the place.
Yeah, it's super difficult to build that cross persona alignment if everyone is having a different view into the data. We really want to help these different personas come together, onto the same team, feel like they're part of a shared effort to manage these bots. So I think each persona, as Tom mentioned, might care about different aspects of bots, or certain aspects of the charts and dashboards might speak a little bit differently to them. But ultimately, we are envisioning that this solution helps bring all those personas that are very diverse together by building this shared strategic view.
And I think getting out of those silos can be really valuable too. It may be that
Yep.
like one persona has a particular view that they depend on, but it's dangerous if that's the only perspective they have. So if you have all of these different tools and people are, locked into their tool, they may be missing a larger part of the
Yep.
story that has like real financial impact.
And that makes a ton of sense. And like you said, with breaking down the silos and different people using a particular feature, everybody's looking at bots from a different perspective. And so how do these teams kind of come together and figure out which bots are good or bad? And how does Bot Insights help with that decision?
Yeah. I mean, I think the way I think about it is that Bot Insights shines a light on what's happening, and helps them. So in many cases, for organizations that are maybe pre-knowledge is maybe one way you can put it, right? They now have a somewhat of an understanding of even the different types of bots, where they're originating from, the cost of serving traffic to them, the volume of data. So I think being able to shed a light there for many organizations is really the first step for them even being able to understand what's actually happening. And then they can kind of burn down from there, starting with, what are some known categories that we want to kind of block or kind of manage a different way, and then wait and see for some other ones. So even speaking of AI bots, there's some companies in the travel search engine space, for example, where they actually are waiting to see what's going to happen with AI bots, because some of the AI tools, they might, if you're looking to book a flight from New York to LA and they end up referring you to their search engine, to their travel product, that may actually be something that they'll want to block. And so that's a situation where if they just said that AI bots are bad, they might actually be losing out on a potential kind of a distribution opportunity or partnership opportunity. So I think in many ways, our goal is to help shed a light on what's happening and help even set the stage to drive the discussion of what might be good, what might be bad. And then once there's been some alignment, how do you change that going forward? How do you maintain that going forward and then adapt down the road if things change? So I think being able to bring all the stakeholders together into a single view, they can at least have that discussion and then iterate from there, which I think for many organizations has been a challenge in the past.
Yeah, you beat me to it there. I was going to say, like, back to the beginning where we said, like, it's not necessarily clear that bots are bad or bots are good. There are exceptions. There are bots that are unequivocally bad and you want to
Mhm.
stop it. But if you talk to two people within the same organization, there's a reasonable chance that they're going to have a different perspective on whether or not a
Yep.
particular bot is good or a particular bot is bad. And that's why having this ability to kind of coalesce all of those costs, benefits, behaviors into a central data set and a central set of analyses is so crucial in order to like actually operate on this in a way that's going to be effective and beneficial to the user, or at least optimal.
No, that makes a ton of sense. As we talk about the bot landscape, we start to hear more of the super cool buzzwords that we've been hearing for the last few months. When we talk about agentic workflows and agentic attacks, from either of your perspectives, like what's coming next in regards to this AI bot land?
Yeah. Agentic is an interesting one. And it gets to sort of something I said earlier about like, as we're starting to think about these attacks that can learn and evolve over time, I think that the real answer is I don't know. I don't know what's coming down the pipeline. I don't know what's next, but I know that there's a lot of potential for really diverse outcomes, both in terms of sort of that maliciousness where you've got bots that are adapting to human actions like in response or their security actions, and we end up with a race between like the system's trying to block them and them. I mean, we're already there, but the system's trying to block the actions of these bots and these bots adapting to get around them. I think that the agentic workflow kind of approach is interesting. And I think the real value would be for people to embrace it as much as is reasonable. We're going to ignore not we're going to ignore, but like setting aside the malicious bot thing. I think that the best thing that organizations can do moving forward is to understand what the agentic workflows are trying to accomplish and embrace it. Like it's not going anywhere. So if you are a travel site and you've got these agents that are working in, you have a multi-agent system where you've got 3 different agents that are scanning pages at the same site at the same time in order to compare prices, with different contexts and things like that. On the surface, that's bad for the companies that own that particular service, right? Because they're, potentially getting around dynamic pricing and things like that. So I think there's going to need to be a way to understand those behaviors better and then find a way to work within those systems, because you're not going to get rid of them. This, I feel like a broken record, but that's why it always boils down to like getting a deeper understanding of the behaviors and then developing systems to work with them. So, Srini, you called out like the New York Times and the Atlantic who saw this happening and are like, okay, well, we're not going to be able to stop it forever. So let's engage in a licensing process. That's one approach. But there's also, maybe ways that if you understand how these agentic workflows work, you can beat them at their own game, by sending them in a direction that is beneficial to you. So I think that I don't know where things are going, but I do know that none of this stuff is going to go away and they're going to get more sophisticated. And it's a different approach to the internet than what we've had in the past, where it was really point to point or maybe point to cloud. We're now at a place where it's cloud to cloud, and we're going to have to adapt in order to account for that.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is there's going to be lots of new categories of bots that we've never seen before. I think, as you mentioned, agents are one that are emerging. I think, as with anything, you really still need the same approach. The problem doesn't really change from someone who operates on the internet, which is you need to understand and identify the bots that are coming, whether it's a new pattern or an existing pattern, and then you need to form a strategy as to what to do, and then you need a way to enforce that strategy, and then you need a way to validate that the strategy is actually happening, and then being able to continuously monitor and update over time. I think they're just another class of bots, and I think you really need to continue doing more of this bot visibility, bot management that people have already been doing. It's just another category, and they are, as Tom mentioned, they do have some unique properties. In some sense, it's almost like a bot trying to be a human. It's kind of an interesting thing, but it's still, the name of the game is still to kind of understand, validate, and then enforce the policy that the organization finds is best for them.
Yeah. I agreed. I think your call out that it's not that it's just one class of bot is really important and kind of critical to note. We should be thinking in terms of behaviors as opposed to low level metrics like counts or things like that, and start to be saying like, okay, this kind of bot acts in this way. This kind of bot acts in this way, unless it acts in this way. And I think focusing on that behavior stuff is really the critical piece to prepare yourself for what comes next.
That makes a ton of sense. And I kind of want to dig into some of that. Like, as you guys were working together and building this product and getting it ready, what surprised you most about like looking at the data behind like bot behavior?
Yeah, I'll let Tom take this one.
Okay. Well, I think that the easy answer for me is everything, because I am aware of some of the standard use cases around bots and SEO. And then, you hear all the horror stories about malicious bots and DDoS and stuff like that. But what really captured my attention early on was sort of the nuance of how the bot landscape worked. It's much more diverse than I had really envisioned. And that's even before we get to the notion of like agentic type behavior. Like also the problems. I think the biggest thing that I sort of really took away is like that how little we actually understand about what the potential consequences, good and bad, are from bot traffic. And, you know, talking with people and hearing their stories about like this bad outcome happened because we were blocking bots without knowing it, or like it wasn't a problem that they were scraping our site, but we saw this other side effect. Like that's really the biggest takeaway, is like how little we know about the larger landscape, and how in order to protect ourselves and to leverage these tools, we need to have a much deeper understanding and build a framework and an ontology almost of how these bots behave, as opposed to kind of lumping them into these big categories and saying, okay, we're going to block that and we're going to not block that. It really boils down to the behaviors themselves are so interesting, whether they're, you know, pretty low tech and dumb or they're very sophisticated. They're interesting. And honestly, that's why there's been an industry around bot detection and SEO for as long as the internet has been around, is because it's not as cut and dry as these are good and these are bad. And I think that the big thing that's come out recently is like we're now not necessarily seeing even more diversity, but we're seeing a rapid expansion in the diversity of bots faster than we have in the past. And I think that's all the more reason to get into that like behavior analytics space early.
I think the only thing I would add is what surprised me the most is actually what organizations seem to care about when it comes to bots. It just varies so much depending on the industry that you're in or the person that you're talking to, and they have a different lens into the data that they're looking at. You know, some people might think in terms of IP addresses, some people might think in terms of the vendor or the category, some people might have a obsession over cost. All these are valid. And I think it's just really interesting because depending on who you speak, you know, who you talk with, they're focused on their view and they may not even be aware of the other ways of thinking about bots or the other data points that are worth looking at or the other data feeds that they should consider, which, you know, again, brings us back to why the strategic alignment is so important. If you're a security person, you might be, maybe you're the person that's responsible for bot management, but, you know, when Google can't crawl your site anymore, that's maybe more of a marketing and revenue concern that is outside of the purview of a security team, but it's still in the landscape of bots. And so yeah, I think the data that you're looking at and the persona that you fall into definitely colors the view, I think, of what you consider important bots to care about, versus there's just so many types and there's so many different personas or organizations that could care about bots, and it's really hard to bring everyone together and build that alignment.
I think that every organization has the person who's just like, how much does this cost? How much does this cost? And forgets about everything else.
So with that, as we begin to kind of like wrap up, if you could go back and tell yourself one thing about AI bots that became, or before they became prevalent, like what would it be?
Don't assume that you know what they are and how they work. I think that, you know, for those of us who've used these various AI tools, because I mean, who hasn't, right? Who hasn't gone on to ChatGPT or Claude or Grok and said like, oh, hey, I'm trying to find X. You know, it seems like it's easy to understand. Okay, well, they go out and they scrape the site and they compare it with this but that's not necessarily the case. There's a lot more going on than we understand. And I think that that's the biggest thing that I would want to tell myself is like, just don't make assumptions that you understand how this system works.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think it's even the vendors themselves have changed how they do things. Like, you know, some of these large LLM providers, like they've relied more on common crawl data, or they did like one big crawl, maybe, right? And some have more search-oriented products, like ChatGPT has a search product where they might actually go out and act more like Google, where they're actually getting more real-time information. The landscape is just continuously changing, and there's new entrants into the space from all over. There's just so much frenetic energy here. And so I think it's just interesting to note how much the landscape has changed even within AI bots. And so, yeah, to Tom's point, I wouldn't just read like a few papers and say, okay, this is obviously how AI bots are getting their data. This is what we have to do to manage.
And don't be scared, be knowledgeable.
Exactly.
That is true. And so with that, my final question, what's one thing you want people to remember from this conversation?
Srini, I'll let you go first.
I was just going to say the thing that you just said, Tom. I thought that was great. I was like, don't be scared, be knowledgeable. Yeah, one thing to remember from this conversation, I think it's, bots are not new, but the types of bots and the behaviors that bots are taking on are constantly changing and constantly presenting themselves in new ways. So, definitely I recommend everyone listening to this to start by understanding what bots are doing on their web properties, whether you have a little personal blog or you're operating a huge, streaming service. I think I'd always start by understanding the problem and then deeply understand the problem, then deeply understanding what's actually important to your organization, because you could spend, it's probably, multiple teams full-time jobs just understanding and chasing down all these bots. So you really have to understand and prioritize what actually matters to your organization. So I think those two, it's just super important. And as a plug for Bot Insights, I do think that's where we fit in. I think that's where we really focus on, is helping organizations build that understanding and build that shared alignment. Then you can go, in some sense, blocking the bots is only part of the problem. It's everything else that is also super important. So don't skip that phase, I guess, would be my advice.
Yeah. I mean, basically the same, but, focus on behaviors, not on bots. We talk, that's a little ironic since it's called Bot Insights, but the insights is more important than the bots part, that you want to understand and be working on behavior as opposed to like saying bots are bad. I think that's the biggest thing to take away.
Awesome. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. This has been
Thank
super,
you.
no pun intended, insightful. Again, it was great talking to you, and we've learned so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.